Hi, this is Jason Cascarino. Welcome to the Lessons in Adolescence podcast, a production of the Remaking Middle School initiative. You can learn about Remaking Middle School on the web at remakingmiddleschool.org. Now, here's this episode. Hello and welcome to the Lessons in Adolescence podcast, where we explore the many facets that impact young adolescents in the middle school years, from the adverse to the awkward to the awesome. I'm your host, Jason Cascarino. Today, we have my conversation with Stephanie Malia Krauss, author of the youth development focused books Making It and her most recent release, Whole Child, Whole Life. Stephanie has a broad experience as an educator, school leader, youth worker, researcher, writer, and advocate. Having had a challenging educational experience herself as a young person, including dropping out of school after the 8th grade, Stephanie works to help adults who educate, develop, and care for adolescents to better understand the array of factors that drive their growth and behavior, so that adults can best prepare and support them along their developmental journey.
In order for kids to thrive, they have to be ready for the world as it is, but they also have to be well. And so then the job of adults is to prepare and care for them. And so for me, where Making It was about how do we prepare kids for the future and get them ready? Whole Child, Whole Life emerged as this book to say, how do we take good care of kids and make sure they feel cared for and that they have what they need to care for themselves across a lifetime, and what actually matters the most there.
In part one of our conversation, Stephanie and I talk about her motivations for writing her book, her approach to capturing and translating the volumes of research on adolescent learning and development in an accessible way for all readers, while keeping true to the rigor of the research, and how youth are nestled within demographic and determinant profiles that help define who they are and help adults best understand and support them. In part two, we talk about the meat of the book, namely the 10 practices that adults do for kids to help them thrive, importantly starting with mental health, and including such factors as embracing culture and identities, nurturing social health through relationships, and nudging social wealth through community supports. We also talk about the centrality of belonging and what thriving actually looks like when you see it. And we learn about what Stephanie is doing now to get this knowledge out to those who need it. That's in a little bit. Now, here's part one of my conversation with Stephanie Malia Krauss. Stephanie, thank you so much for joining me on the podcast. It's wonderful to get the chance to talk with you.
It's so good to sit down for this conversation, Jason.
So before we get into your book, Whole Child, Whole Life, let's make sure our listeners just have a sense of who you are and where you're coming from. You have a long line of experience with some marquee organizations in the education and youth space. So Teach for America, Forum for Youth Investment, Jobs for the Future. And most of the roles that I saw use the term fellow in the title. And there are two things that I think of when I see the title fellow. One is you're kind of your own agent. You operate with some independence and maybe choice as to what you take on. But two, you're around to capture and advance knowledge of some sort, which I think suits a big thinker and an author. Maybe just share a bit about this career path that you've defined for yourself.
So I'll tell you, it's been a very non-traditional career path. And I think given the focus of the podcast and thinking about tweens and teens and young adults, I'll take us all the way back to being a GED recipient at 16. And I showed up on a college campus, 16 years old, with my last full year of school completed being the 8th grade. Like I went to some days of 9th grade and some days of 10th grade, but otherwise was chronically absent. And the question that I had for myself was, what on earth do I have that makes me ready for this? Because I shouldn't have been ready. And yet I was able to make it in adulthood at 16 years old. And so in my career path, I've really been in pursuit of the same questions. And then I've positioned myself professionally wherever I can make the most impact to answer and advance those questions. So at 16 years old, the questions were personal. And then when I became a teacher, I was at the time the youngest person to ever be accepted into Teach for America. I was 18 years old, which is insane. I never would have hired myself to be a teacher. And I had wanted to be a teacher, and it was incredible. And suddenly I had all of my students' stories. And so it wasn't just me anymore. I was asking, what do they need to thrive? And what will it take for them to be ready? And that's what actually pulled me out of the classroom, because I was conflicted between what I was taught to deliver, content, curriculum, focus on school culture, and all of the outside factors that I was seeing deeply impact their lives and learning that I was not trained for. And so at that point, I left the classroom and coaching. I was doing both. And I went to social work school and had kind of a macro view on policy and systems and structures and social and economic development more broadly for young people. During that time, I was invited to start a school in St. Louis for youth who had not been successful, who are overage and undercredited. Today, we call them opportunity youth. It was on a technical college campus. And so at that point, I transitioned to school leader. And even as a school leader, there was such a conflict between all of the course requirements and the credit requirements and the compliance requirements and what I actually knew an entire school of kids needed to thrive and to be ready for adulthood. And that was when the fellow status started. The founders of the Forum for Youth Investment heard about my struggle and story in St. Louis. And they said, we too, at the national level, have been asking these questions of what does it take for young people to be ready for college, work, and life? And what does it take for them to thrive? And like, will you come and think about that with us? And that was a decade ago, which is wild to consider. It's always the age of my younger child. And so for the past 10 years, I've kind of moved across organizations and initiatives, trying to more deeply understand. And so the writing part of the work really came out of the shift from local work to national work and realizing there were all of these smart people at the national level who were answering the questions I was asking, but that knowledge was not trickling down and being translated in a way that it got to the everyday folk and the folks on the front lines working with and raising kids. And so the writing part of my life really was an attempt to make sure that all of that knowledge was available and accessible for the people who are caring for kids every day.
Yeah, it's interesting. A lot of our work at the Remaking Middle School initiative is around this sort of disconnect between youth development, what kids need developmentally, and what they're getting in formal education environments. And oftentimes they're not in sync. And this notion of translation, which is a term that we use quite a lot as well. Like there's a great deal of science and literature out there about what kids need, but the translation of that to everyday practice, both in school, out of school settings, et cetera, is something that is really seriously needed. So to dive into that, your book is called Whole Child, Whole Life, 10 Ways to Help Kids Live, Learn, and Thrive. I was taken by your ability and frankly your willingness to bring together personal narrative, the research and the evidence, and the sort of real world practical examples and advice around learning and development of young people. But before we get into the actual content, just tell us a little bit about your motivations for writing this book and how it came about.
I think this book, maybe even more than my first book, Making It, which is about what young people need to be ready for the future. This book was really born of my heart and born of my bones. These are things that I am needing to know as a grown-up raising two kids right now, as I think about what do they need in this moment and what will they need in a very volatile and uncertain world, and in a world with so many choices and so much information and so much pressure. What can I possibly prioritize and say, okay, this is actually what's most essential? So to kind of take you back, in the middle of the pandemic, my first book, Making It, came out, and it was this love letter back to the front lines from this national post saying, hey, this is what we needed to know, that young people actually need to be ready. Here is what I found. And here is how the world is changing and how the workforce is changing and what we can expect from the future and what we don't know that we don't know and what that means for kids. The book comes out at the height of the pandemic. And so I'm doing this Zoom book tour, and everybody is afraid of true existential threats. And these kids at home were at the height of it. And so every time that I would talk, somebody would say, "Thank you so much for telling us about the future and what kids will need when they get there." Or a teacher or a school leader would say, "Oh my God, what do they need now? I'm afraid the kids are not okay." And I think what I recognized at the time was I was worried about whether my kids were going to be okay and what truly it would take to kind of wayfind in this very uncertain, unmapped time. And the gift of working nationally for the last 10 years and working at some of those places that you mentioned, and then also building a network, was I recognized the responsibility I had being connected to some of the absolute pinnacle change makers and scholars who think about the most important parts of child and youth development. And the other thing that I was aware of was this idea that in order for kids to thrive, they have to be ready for the world as it is, but they also have to be well. And so then the job of adults is to prepare and care for them. And so for me, where making it was about how do we prepare kids for the future and get them ready? Whole Child, Whole Life emerged as this book to say, how do we take good care of kids and make sure they feel cared for and that they have what they need to care for themselves across a lifetime, and what actually matters the most there. And so then I just went on this journey of inviting these really smart, talented, luminary folks to come into conversation with me and help me understand each of the distinct parts of what is really supportive of thriving and what is really supportive of us caring for kids.
Yeah, I read the list of luminaries, your acknowledgments, and it's sort of like an all-star list. So I like that idea of sort of bringing together all those knowledgeable people. And it was definitely something that I was curious about on your end as a writer, how you approach the research and the presentation of that research, just given the volumes of literature on child and youth development. It strikes me just as an extraordinary task to capture and present all of this in an accessible way. How did you think about that as you took this on?
I'm so glad you asked that question. Nobody has asked this question yet, and there really was some like intention and strategy behind it. There were a couple of rules that I set for myself when I began writing Whole Child, Whole Life. One was to be timely and timeless. This is the thing that I like wrote on Post-its, and I really wanted to ensure that everything that I was writing could be contextualized to what we are seeing and needing right now, but also preserve and promote the science that has always been true for what young people need and what humans need to have a full human experience. I mean, I think this driving motivation for me, again, was while I am an educator and a social worker and a researcher and a writer and these other pieces, my strongest formed identity in this moment is as a mom. And so I was thinking about all of the adults who are working with and caring for my kids besides me. And how could I write something that every single one of them, teacher, coach, counselor, other parents, that any of them could read and it would actually be meaningful and it would be memorable. I think especially for parents and coaches, we have a job to do, but we don't take classes for that job and we don't get training for that job. So it is a resource that can be read cover to cover, but also that people can return to as their kids or the kids that they work with hit different situations and stages. The second was, could I write this at a 6th grade level or below? Because I know that there are adults who do an incredible job caring for kids, who want to do what is best for kids, and that their reading level does not go above a middle school level, or they don't have time to work through really dense material and collegiate academic material. So I wanted it to feel almost as though we were sitting down for coffee together without, rule number 3, diluting or shortchanging the sharpness and specifics of any of the research. I had a list of scholars I was counting on, and I would write in a way that felt accessible and actionable and hopefully enjoyable. And then I would send it to them and I would say, is this still true? Is the translation correct? Is it valid? The last thing was an important timing piece, which is while I was writing Whole Child, Whole Life, the country was embroiled in education being at the center of culture wars, including social emotional learning and other things being called into question. And so the other task that I took on was, could I write this in a way that centered kids and not systems, that really attended to what do kids need in any system or space that they spend time? And that meant that I was going to talk about things like identity, but also spirituality, and just say, if we are in the business of caring for kids, here's all the things we need to know. But I wanted to write it in a way that could get into any community that has children living there. And this is a tricky decision. I wasn't going to play politics, but I also wasn't going to use terms that confuse or divide everyday people. I was going to unpack those terms and still talk about things that support and promote justice and equity, for example, but really ask myself every time I use those words, is it because it is the best way to communicate this idea? Or is it because I believe I need to use this word for somebody else? And then who else won't be able to read this piece?
Yeah, I like the idea of sort of situating yourself in the lens of the young person. You offer in the book some really helpful frameworks. Again, it's this translation piece. How do you get all of this information in a form that people can really sort of absorb? And having sort of frameworks, I think, is helpful in that regard to just sort of process and digest a lot of information. And I really like the framework you have up front that talks about how youth are nestled within the broader context of what you call demographic and determinant profiles. Talk us through a little bit about that framework and why it's important to understand these profiles at the outset.
For anybody listening who hasn't read the book, the very first part is about developing a detailed, high definition portrait, I call it, of a young person, where we start with, what do we know? What's the basic outline of who a kid is? And we end with those fine details. Where are they standing? What's the environment like? What's the texture? Those pieces. So this first chapter, Demographics and Determinants, talks about that basic profile or outline. So demographics often is, how they look or how they present themselves, not always, but often. And how they live are these social determinants, things like, what are their living conditions like? What are their education conditions like? What are the broader environment conditions? How they look changes less than how they live over time. But both give us a starting picture of how the kids experience the world, and maybe even more importantly, how the world experiences and treats them because of how they look and how they live. I mean, I think about when I was teaching fifth grade and coaching middle school, you get a new class roster and invariably someone's like, I know that family, or, oh, you know where he lives? He lives over there. Or, oh, I taught his brother. Oh my God. And so we have all of those anecdotal pieces of data. And then in an education system, we also have the actual data from management systems and these points that are supposed to mean something. I think our job is to hold a real honest appraisal of what outline we've drawn for each child. And then ask ourselves, what does that mean in terms of the possible risks and opportunities and vulnerabilities that that kid is going to experience? The next part of that is, if we are responsible for working with students or working with children in a youth development setting or some other setting, asking ourselves, what part of this profile do I not actually know about? And how do I go about learning what it is like to learn or live when you live like this, when you look like this?
That was part one of my conversation with Stephanie Malia Krauss. In part two, we talk about the 10 practices that adults can do for kids to help them thrive, including work and activities around mental health, culture and identities, social health, community supports, and belonging. We also talk about what thriving actually looks like when you see it. And we'll get to know how Stephanie is using her book to educate, coach, and support others. That's coming up in just a little bit on the Lessons in Adolescence podcast, where we feature conversations with researchers, practitioners, program developers, and advocates for young adolescents in the middle school years. In the previous 3 seasons of our program, we have had the privilege of showcasing a wide range of ideas, issues, and impact across the spectrum of young adolescent learning and development, in school and out of school. Our nearly 40 conversations to date have dealt with topics like experiential learning, career exploration, mental and behavioral health, effective teaching practices and learning environments, out of school and summer learning experiences and programs, civic engagement, race and socioeconomic influences, social and emotional learning, mentoring and developmental relationships, and many more topics, all centered around young people between the ages of 10 and 15 in the early part of adolescence. Here's a few quick snippets from our previous episodes.
There's a lot of underestimation happening, and that's one of the key reasons why we talk about underestimating youth. For example, if I run an entrepreneurship program called We Thrive, right, and I were to go into several classrooms, and only some of those classrooms get to create the real company, and the others, they just get to do a business plan or a pitch competition, what that ended up reflecting was a belief in who can do it. And the problem with that is when you lead with that in your programming, you prescribe that outcome. And to me, coming from those communities, that is like one of the greatest disservices that you can do with that community, because their time is valuable too. Those children also are getting prepared so that by the time they are entering their career, college, and so on and so forth, they are ready to win based on their own definitions of winning, what winning and success looks like as new socioeconomic leaders.
And I think the other thing that is sort of powerful for middle grade educators especially, but really for all educators, is just how much the research shows that GPA and attendance are malleable. And I think people get really fixated on test scores for good reason. They've been part of accountability systems. They're easy to measure and to track, but they're really, research has shown, not super malleable. Yeah, as kids' test scores change across time a little bit here and there at the edges, but GPAs really are much more open to that movement, and I think are more of a place of where people feel a little bit more agency. Like, yes, I can help my students unlock ways to get better grades or ways to, be more successful in their classes, more so than moving those test scores. And at the end of the day, we find it's more predictive in research that the consortium has done in the past that GPA and attendance are actually better indicators than test scores.
So you want your messages to convey that kind of openness. And openness is a neutral concept, right? Openness isn't positive or negative. But what we have to realize is that our discourse about young people is overwhelmingly negative. Our narratives are overwhelmingly kind of danger, aligned. And what we need to do is not get woo-woo and hopey-changey and unrealistic about how adolescence is this wonderful, rosy, good all the time kind of time of life. But we do need to communicate in ways that balance the kind of risk, which is real, with the opportunity, which is equally real. And so what I would love to see is people who are communicating about these issues, almost more than anything else, is to really think about that idea of balance. How do I counteract an overwhelmingly negative discourse by introducing the idea of opportunity, of learning, of the potential of this period of time?
Air quality, access to daylight and views, appropriate acoustic environments that aren't, you're not hearing HVAC noise, you're not hearing buzzing lights, there's enough absorptive material in the classroom, really impact people's ability to learn and to function cognitively. And these are things that are talked about a lot in the design of, Class A office space. Employers, are eating this up, return on investment, fewer sick days. But these are not things that many school districts have learned to demand of their buildings. And who is in there, in middle school, like we've discussed today, people who are at some of their most sensitive development. And, shouldn't that be the top priority for who gets this kind of healthy environment?
You can catch all of our episodes on your favorite podcast platform or by visiting remakingmiddleschool.org. And now, here is part 2 of my conversation with Stephanie Malia Krauss. You summarize and organize so many features of child development, so the cognitive, the physical, social, emotional, and the rest. Our emphasis on this podcast is the early adolescent period, so roughly ages 10 through 15. That's roughly grades 4 through 9. And the reason we focus on that period is because outside early childhood, as you know, it is the biggest and fastest transition that youth experience across all of these developmental features. And that's not to say other periods are less important. It's just that this period did has some very unique and also consequential aspects to it that tend to stick with young people for a long time. And you walk through a lot of these aspects chapter by chapter. It's really kind of a tour de force. I think most books like this may have started with another developmental feature, perhaps. You started with mental health. Why did you start there? I mean, I think we all kind of generally know the answer to that question, but I'd love to hear you talk about why you started there.
So the second part of the book crystallizes these 10 practices that, in the same way we talk about lifelong learning, this is about lifelong thriving. What are practices that we as the adults do for kids? And then, like good learning is, we do with them, and eventually, hopefully, they are doing it for themselves. That will always be important for every age and stage of life. It looks different at different stages, but it will always be important. And so once I had identified those 10, I got on the phone with a couple of the smartest people I know, and we looked at the outline, the bones of the book, and we were like, okay, what is the right order? What are the right words? So when it came to prioritizing mental health, I'll go back to being timely and timeless. This is the first book of its kind that came out after the height of the pandemic. And what I knew from my prior work is that we are 20 years deep in an age of incredible volatility and uncertainty that kind of kicked off after 9/11 and has just grown since. And as we sit in this moment of recording and we look at the environment and we look at politics and we look at the lack of peace in the Middle East, we can predict that that volatility and uncertainty will not only remain mainstays, but potentially could get worse, which is where we get to mental health. So what we know in the now moment is that there is an unprecedented rise that started escalating before the pandemic, and then the pandemic was just an accelerant of mental health challenges that young people are experiencing. And while I thought for some time about just calling the chapter Prioritize Health, I recognized that we, the grown-ups, do not get training and education on the basics of mental health care for kids, what to look for, what to do, what to say, emotional wound care, mental health hygiene, these everyday practices. And so when you look at the bigger context of how kids have been growing up for the past 20 years, and likely how they will continue growing up for the next 20, we can expect that it's not a matter of if a kid will have a mental health challenge, but when, which means that every single adult needs to be equipped for that and for what to do. And so I wanted to start there because I go straight from meeting basic needs to prioritizing mental health, because it is so fundamental and foundational and a critical acute need that is as much about surviving as it is about thriving.
Yeah, it really was a unique feature of the book. And I just was really struck by being very explicit about it. On the broader sort of developmental pieces, young people are starting to define themselves. And this process of identity formation is heavily driven by their social context, their relationships with peers, the influences of who they associate with. I like to refer to this as a period of self-discovery. You talk a lot in the book about the process of exploration. Talk a little bit about some of the most effective ways that you've gleaned from the luminaries that you talked to and the research that we, again, as adults, can engage with young people to carve out the right environments and experiences for them to engage in this self-discovery process. Are we setting them up properly? Are we putting together the right environments for them to go through this developmental process of self-discovery, of defining who they are and carving out their own path? Talk a little bit about that whole process.
You're right. There was that personal motivation to keep writing and to keep thinking about what kind of environments do I want my kids and any kid to be in that is going to keep them safe and keep them supported, and also really be that playground for exploration and discovery. I think one of the things, Jason, that was really important to me, not only in my writing, but since the book came out, in my speaking, is to make sure that people who don't have formal training in child and youth development understand the central task of adolescence is to answer the question, who am I and where do I belong? And similarly, when I cover service and spirituality later on in the book, another evolving question as they get into their teen years is, am I a part of something bigger? And where can I make contributions? Is there a meaning and purpose to all of this? And so there was this important need to match story with science and to really anchor in that space, because I think we're storied people. It can be really scary for adults to watch kids they care about explore in ways that feel new or different from the kinds of explorations maybe we have done. But if we can have a better sense of what is to be expected of these years and what they will need from us in that space, I think we're better for it. Having gone through education school and social work school, I can tell you everything I learned had to be pulled from readings and different pieces that came from across spaces, and then my own professional learning as an adult. So if I lacked training as I was training to become an educator at a top ranked school and a social worker at a top ranked school, you can only imagine how many other people are out there working with kids every day who have best intentions in mind, but don't know what's to be expected.
Yeah, as a parent myself, we have a 16-year-old and a 12-year-old. So our older one, it was fascinating. He wrote an essay for his English class talking about basically his identity. He played baseball for the longest time. And then the last year he took up running. Now he's on cross country and he's running track and so forth. He was talking about the evolution of his identity from a baseball player to a runner and what that meant in terms of how he thought about himself and what communities he was connected to. I mean, you think about sports, you think about, okay, that's an extra thing. Those things are central to this identity formation. And it's their project to do that. And they're thinking about it all the time. We may be thinking about other things like, are they safe or do they have their bicycle helmet on and so forth? Or the teachers may be thinking, okay, can they do this math problem? But they're thinking about themselves and who they are and what they want to become.
I'll tell you, one of the most powerful conversations I had when I was writing the book was with a colleague and a friend to Youth-Nex, Joanna Williams, who's now at the Search Institute. And her scholarship really focuses on racial and ethnic identity development in adolescents. And one of the things I found so striking when we were talking is she said, and I'm paraphrasing here, but like so many adults just assume that a child's Blackness or their being Latinx or I'm Native Hawaiian, their being Native is the central part of their identity development. But any given moment in the life of a tween or teen, that may or may not be the focus. It may be the transition from being a baseball player to being a runner, and having a middle schooler who is baseball obsessed and preoccupied and playing and thinking. I can only imagine the dramatic shift. That part of his identity is more important oftentimes than the fact that he's also Native Hawaiian and Jewish. And yet, if we travel to Hawaii to see family and to be immersed in that culture, that part of his identity sort of comes up and blossoms, and it's an opportunity for discovery there.
In terms of what adults can do, I really like your alliterative framing at one point in the book where you talk about this nurture and nudge that you use, which is just sort of nicely distills, I think, what we as adults can do and that we need to do to help young people develop these skills, and they are skills for relationships. Tell us a little bit about the process of nurturing and nudging in terms of relationship building.
Like many things in my life, I cannot take credit for that. That phrase comes from my dear colleague in Virginia, Gina Keller, who was trained as a school counselor and then was a superintendent and has been working at the state level in education, and also as a mom and grandma to a brood of kids. And we talk about this idea of nurture and nudge, not only for kids, but also for grownups. So for this chapter on nurturing healthy relationships, it's a part of a cluster of practices that support thriving talked about in the book. So there are 3 of them. One is nurturing healthy relationships. The other is embracing cultures and identities, which we just started to talk about. And the last is building community and belonging. It's what my colleague in Hawaii, Ka'anoi, would say. It's like the deep social exhale of these social beings. So for us as adults, I think number one, we need to know, and this is true, like whoever's listening to this, whether you're an academic or on the front lines or anything in between, that in the research, it continues to be true that if you look across the lifespan and life outcomes, nothing is more important and powerful and transformational than the presence of nurturing relationships. So there is social health. And I think about that as the nurturing. And then there's social wealth, which for me is the nudging. How do we make sure that our kids that we're working with or raising or fighting on behalf of have the services and supports and skills that they need to really experience and enjoy relationships with us, relationships with each other, relationships with themselves, and that we also have the skills and supports we need to be in relationship with the whole ecosystem of adults who are connected to those kids that we care for. And then how do we make sure that we are helping them, as a researcher in there and a dear friend, John Zaff at Boston University talks about, we can take this whole web of support around a kid and convert it so that it can also build their connections. So we're building care and we're building connections. In the research on relationships, they would call this bonding and bridging. But nudging and nurturing is sort of a similar idea at a more transactional, relational way.
A lot of my work these days is on post-secondary education, particularly access and success for underrepresented students. And in that space, we talk a lot about this concept of fit, match, and affordability. So match and affordability are pretty straightforward. Does a student's post-secondary option match their academic abilities and their potential? And can they afford that option with the resources that they have available? But fit is trickier. This really comes down to this sense of belonging. Is this institution that I'm choosing a place where I see myself being successful? Are there other folks who are like me here? Is it a place of support and care and potential for thriving? So this concept of belonging and this fit, it's often seen as kind of squishy and hard to measure. But we're finding in the post-secondary space that it's a greater influence on students' choices over and above match and affordability. So this belongingness is a key driver of how young people are seeing themselves and also making decisions that are consequential to their long-term trajectories.
Yeah, I think this idea of belonging and the importance of healthy relationships remains the absolute standout for me because it is so much a part of the DNA and wiring of the human experience. One of the neatest things that I learned when I was writing these chapters was that we all get educated on this fight or flight instinct. Most people know fight or flight, something happens, but rarely do we get educated on this other instinct that we have, which is called tend and befriend, that all the way back to the oldest days of humanity, we were wired to connect to each other to stay alive and to also have that human experience. So not only does this idea of cultivating healthy relationships and community and belonging feel squishy, but most often, except for like great mentoring programs in some other places, we kind of leave it to chance. Like, oh yeah, it'll just happen or it won't happen. But there are deliberate strategies and skills that we, the adults, can deploy to help kids build and nourish and feed the relationships and find the relationships in their life. And what we see, especially for young people of color and those who are farthest from opportunity, that exactly as you've said, belonging and the presence of caring community are the sort of standout quality. Even when you read about blue zones, the places in the world where people live the longest, healthiest lives, most of those places prioritize relationships, and the presence of collective community and belonging is a core feature of how they do life.
Well, there's so many pieces that I would love to talk with you about, but in the interest of time, you end on this idea of aiming for wholeness. What is aiming for wholeness?
Fundamentally, there are a couple of things that we want for kids. We want them to be good humans, and we want them to have good lives. A part of having a good life is having the ability to thrive in your life, to flourish in what you do. And so if we think about the kind of equation of that, the science was pretty clear on what does thriving look like when you see it. And when you see it, it's actually the presence of a couple of core, identifiable, observable things that kids feel at once safe and supported, healthy and healing, rooted and connected, that they are learning and growing, and that they are living with joy and purpose. I used to think that it was this kind of sequencing of a kid was in survival mode, and then eventually they shifted into thriving, and that you couldn't do both at once. And the way I now think of it is that in a day or in a week, the ability for a kid to thrive looks more like an EKG. It goes up and it goes down, but what you want to get to is this kind of band where even as they go up and down, the conditions are still there, where they feel safe and supported, like they are able to live in a healthful way for whatever that means for them, that there is a sense of novelty, and then the joy and purpose, that there is some sense of meaning to the moment, to their life. That is what we are looking to create. And the practices we've been talking about, prioritizing mental health, embracing identity and culture, nurturing healthy relationships, those things build toward the kinds of environmental conditions that make those characteristics of wholeness or thriving possible. For me, that is the ultimate aim. It knocks out a focus on performance or a focus on success. It also is endlessly hopeful for me because you can see how those lights of wholeness can come true in all different contexts. So you don't have to be at a certain class level to experience wholeness. You don't have to be in a certain community to experience wholeness. You just need the right environments and experiences and grown-ups who are supporting the conditions to be there.
What's next for you? Where would you like to see this book go? What has writing and releasing it, promoting this book inspired you to take on in the future?
The focus has been going out and working with any school district, state, nonprofit, youth development organization, parenting group who will have me. And the focus being getting this resource into their hands. I think about it as a cross trainer. Like, okay, the complexity of the child and tween and teen experience, here's the fundamentals of what we need to know. And then supporting them in using the book as a resource to do the reflection and have the conversations that they know they need to have, and provides this platform of like, okay, let's talk about identity development. Let's talk about service. Let's talk about relationships. Let's think about what this means with the kids in our lives and with the work that we do. So the focus is increasingly becoming working to really deploy that resource and then customize it for organizations like 4-H or Campfire, communities and schools, or large school districts, small school districts, which has been great fun.
Well, Stephanie, this has been a lot of fun for me, and I've enjoyed reading the book. It certainly was helpful as I was having interactions with my kids along the way. As you know, these things kind of come up almost on a daily basis. So I appreciate you writing it. I appreciate you getting it out there. I appreciate you translating it and all that it entails to folks that need it the most.
Thanks so much. I appreciate it, Jason. It was so good to be here.
That was Stephanie Malia Krauss, author of the book Whole Child, Whole Life, 10 Ways to Help Kids Live, Learn, and Thrive. The book is available on Amazon and at other booksellers. You can learn more about Stephanie, her work, and her books online at wholechildwholelife.com, on Twitter at Stephanie_Malia, and on Instagram and LinkedIn at Stephanie Malia Krauss. Thanks for joining the Lessons in Adolescence podcast, a production of Remaking Middle School, an initiative that seeks to transform the learning and development experience for young adolescents in the middle school years. Remaking Middle School brings together good educational practice in school and out of school with the latest developmental science. You can learn about Remaking Middle School or find more resources about the topics of this podcast on the web at remakingmiddleschool.org. The Lessons in Adolescence podcast and Remaking Middle School are products of Youth-Nex, the University of Virginia Center for Effective Youth Development, which you can visit online at education.virginia.edu/youth-nex, N-E-X, or on Facebook and YouTube at Youth-Nex, and on Twitter X and Instagram at Youth_Nex. Lessons in Adolescence is produced by Abby Gillespie and me, Jason Cascarino. Editing by Sophia Moore. You can listen to or download each episode at the Remaking Middle School website or on Apple Podcasts, Google, Spotify, or wherever you find your podcasts. Thanks for listening.